So we had been wanting to do the whole Route 66 in an old car, of course. I think that's the right way to do it if you're going to have fun and, of course, add a little bit of adventure. But it didn't work out for a few years, and so we finally did the trip in the spring of 2017. So the first damage to the car was actually rock that took out windshield. Original windshields managed to last 40 some odd years, but apparently this one 2 years is good. That was going down the freeway in Montana. So even the first day of driving it, the heat actually took the idle air controller out. So it's the one that sold with Holly's. They're kind of inexpensive throttle body. It's actually a Chrysler stepper motor type, and apparently off their V10s. So nice part is it's standard enough part, but not common enough. So we ended up in Billings, who went ahead and bought it. That required us to drive across town to the warehouse, which was a 20-minute drive, or wait 2 hours for it to be delivered. I didn't quite get their math, but okay. Anyway, we ended up with a little bit of crowd around the car there, which is funny because we parked next to a Cobra replica. But so over time I had the idle air controller out. I actually just cranked up the set screw a little bit, told the computer it did not have an idle controller, and that worked fairly well. It's just you had to, I had to idle high enough even if the AC kicked on. We're not going to lug it. So hindsight, I think I could have set it a little lower, but set it high to be safe, and it worked fairly well. Car had been fuel injection for a year. I drove it all summer. Put a couple thousand miles on that, and then that winter, partially because it was still really a loud car with the dual exhaust on it. So I actually finally put the turbo on, and that of course toned it down quite a bit. And of course I guess maybe I should do a video on why that is, but that's a whole nother story. And anyway, I made it much more tolerable. Since we just put the turbo on, we limited our boost, basically the lowest we could control on the wastegate. So basically 3 pounds boost, but drove it a lot before we actually hit the road. Rain or shine, basically I was driving it just to make sure there was no issues. It's normally a summer car, so it's kind of nice to know that it'll go through a rainstorm and all the wipers work, no water got into weird places I didn't know about. And hey, it was good to kind of dial it in a little bit before hitting the road. And it still didn't eliminate problems, but certainly minimized them. The car actually ended up being pretty reliable.
That's right.
Even though the turbo added to our heat-related issues, it was a welcome addition for this trip. Even at the 3 pounds of boost, seat of the pants, I'd guess we're running about 200 horse, and that made it enough if you did want to pass, or like most of the time we're just cruising, but merging on a highway or whatever, you had plenty of power. And though that doesn't help fuel economy, because let's face it, once you have a turbo, you're going to want to put a foot in it occasionally. One thing I didn't realize is the rear end, it's always kind of had a bit of a harmonic above 70 miles an hour, but where we live at now, we're pretty much an hour away from any freeways, so didn't realize how much worse that had gotten. So when we're in the highways that were 80-mile-an-hour highways, we still stuck below 70. Otherwise, the car just had a little too much vibration. But the rear end still held up for the whole trip, which this is a long drive. So also in Illinois there, before we got to Chicago, had the grommet I used for the power brake booster vacuum line split in two. It was barely there, created quite a vacuum leak, so we weren't quite getting the brakes we needed, and the engine wouldn't quite run right. So patched it enough to run over to AutoZone and Funny part is I asked the guy at the counter for that, and he just said, so we wouldn't have that. And I, like the manager, looked at it and says, why don't you look that up before you say that? So he did, and of course they had it in stock. Yeah, at one point we ended up having a power steering just going down the freeway, and it was a little confusing, but just figure out a fluid. When we stopped, the lip seal for the input shaft of the steering box had actually popped out, and it had pumped out all its fluid. So undercarriage probably isn't going to rust for a long time. And anyway, we pushed it back in, hoped that would work, and I think we made it another half day before it popped out again. So while we were in Chicago, we actually found a Ace Hardware downtown Chicago, which was kind of interesting, but got some brass strips, size I thought I could manipulate with what tools I did have in the car, and a hose clamp since the housing for the input shaft is round, and made some angle brackets and hose clamp that was on to keep the lip seal in place. We were joking about what a roadkill fix that was. If you don't get the reference, check out their YouTube channel. You will not be disappointed. The hose clamp and bracket method were actually held up for the rest of the trip. I mean, we still had some issues. The funny part is we'd lost the filler cap for the power steering. That was back in Montana, so that was the first day. And so we actually just used aluminum tape to make a cover for the whole fill spout, and that's what we drove on for the rest of the trip. That also might have been a little roadkill, but I don't think quite as bad as the steering box itself. Winter of 2017 or 2016-17, however you want to put it, we actually threw a gear vendor's overdrive on the back of the 904 transmission. So this is an automatic with an overdrive. It actually got the engine RPMs down quite a bit. So one thing I was unable to test before we took this big of a trip was actually really driving a long time in heat soaking it. We did one trip from Idaho to the Puget Sound. That seemed to be fine, but that's not the same as driving 8 to 9 hours a day. So we ended up having a lot of heat related issues, especially as we got into the south and it warmed up. It was a good thing we did it pretty early in the season. I mean, May, things are still really cool in some areas, but I think the highest temperature we saw was 102 degrees in Needles, which maybe that's cool for them.
There you go.
So this car was originally equipped with a really large radiator for a Slant 6. It's because of the air conditioning, and it also had the heavy-duty cooling option. So it was a really hard radiator to get that size without having a custom made. So we decided to go another route. I actually purchased a aluminum radiator for an E-body. So this is actually wider than the opening on this particular car, which already had the wide opening. So we actually have more capacity in this radiator than ever would have in this car, and it's a tight fit, but thought that the extra capacity would help with the heat issues. Purchased one that actually came with a shroud and 2 fans. It never really fit right, so it actually took a lot of modifications to get it to fit. It's also because it was way outside of specs of what the manufacturer said it would be. In fact, it was an inch longer package than what they mentioned it would be. So, but it was a little leery just because of the overall price, and came with 2 fans, and it should have been my first clue, but on the trip we actually burned up both cooling fans that came with this setup, and it did not help the situation. Luckily it was one at a time. But trying to find universal fans on the road is a little difficult. Luckily, the O'Reilly's chain actually carries 12-inch fan, and those were a little better than what I had in originally, but they still were not adequate for how much air actually needed to flow. We've now upgraded it to Spall fans, which they took some more modifications because they're even larger to fit in, but that I think has helped a lot of that. So at one point I actually even took the gamble and just took the thermostat all the way to get a little more flow through the radiator. Somewhat regretted that when we got back through Oregon. It was actually trying to snow a little bit, so the engine really never warmed up all the way, but at least it ran okay with the Haltech was able to compensate, but that's part of why I didn't want to pull it out in the first place. So with the car's radiator being for an E-body, and it's actually for a modern Hemi, which actually got both of my coolant hoses on the correct side of the car. The V8s in this era, they're kind of diagonal, but anyway, the modern Hemi actually had a larger bottom radiator hose, so I actually used a silicone coupler and then reduced down to the Slant 6 one. But the upper hose, I had tried to use the factory air conditioning hose, but for some reason that has a weird loop up, so pretty much no matter what's happening, the water pump's trying to push up past that. So I actually had switched it to a pair of silicone couplers and actually a kind of a screen filter on the upper one. And unfortunately, because the engine block, it hasn't been rebuilt in 20 years, so it keeps throwing a little bit of rust. And at one point we ended up also having to kind of flush out the system and clean that upper filter out. So Spencer, Missouri was one of the ones that we didn't have pre-planned. We hadn't really seen it on the maps, but it was just one we're going along, and it said old alignment, I think, but basically said route was off to the side, put us on an old bridge, and then the little town of Spencer, and that was a welcome little break. I don't think we had anyone drive through the whole time we had stopped there. So one of the upgrades to the car that was really nice for this trip was we had modified the dash to accept a 7-inch touchscreen navigation unit, and this is actually Pioneer's flagship, which had all the bells and whistles, including CarPlay. First part of the trip, it was fantastic because it would just take you right to where you're going, show you where fuel stops are coming up. Once we got on the Route 66, it was a little more difficult because it's never the fastest path. But what we did do, which benefited us greatly, is program in the next place we wanted to see. So if we ended up off route, simply punch in the next stop, go right to probably the freeway, whatever's the shortest route, get you there, which really saved us some time since we didn't plan enough time into this. It also gave us a few other benefits of seeing what side roads are. Still would show fuel stops along the way. Very, very helpful. So another interesting problem we had was the vapor lock issue. Made it real difficult to start, and we had just fueled up and cranked a few times, and then there's some smoke coming out from the hood because the area around the starter relay had actually caught fire. So the problem there was the wire from the alternator was actually sized enough for all the fans to be on, had a fusible link right before it went to the junction on the starter relay. What I didn't consider is the convoluted tubing you use to cover a lot of wires, especially when you get the colors like the blue I had, is a much lower melting point and apparently far more flammable. So the fusible link was doing its job, it was heating up, it actually had just started to melt itself, sever basically, but that was enough heat to catch that covering on fire. So don't cover your fusible links. Oh, we got put out the fire and actually pulled across the street to a car wash because there was shade there, and I'd actually um, picked up a few things to try to insulate the fuel rail from some more heat, and so we basically took care of that. Fixed a connection to the starter relay so the alternator would actually charge again, and we hit the road after, of course, washing the car since we were there. So one of the other things they had to fix because of the little electrical fire was the car. You could get it to start, but it was barely running, and every time you put it in gear, it would stall. So I basically bypassed the park neutral safety on the transmission to the starter relay and allowed it to start in gear. And since I was obviously overtaxing the main feed from the alternator, I actually found some more 10 gauge wire to run a second loop. Obviously on the road it's hard to get the proper size I needed, and it was surprisingly difficult to get a pair of fusible links to put on each end of that. But anyway, we did get that settled and was able to get that fixed at one of the hotels. So at some point after Tucumcari, the first cooling fan gave out on the car, and it's just one of those we kept heating up more and more. And since we already knew the car had some vapor lock issues in the fuel rail, once it was well heat soaked, we kind of did more of a drive through the painted desert, which was beautiful. Wish we could have stopped more. Still got a few good pictures, but we wanted to keep the car running. And somewhere through there, the battery, which is mounted in the trunk to make room for all the turbo and its systems, actually, I don't think I can quite say exploded, but we did truly have battery acid all over the trunk. Lost a couple souvenir shirts. So anyway, we managed to actually keep it running and together enough to get into Holbrook, and there we actually bought another cooling fan and replaced the battery. And of course the battery we swapped out right there in the parking lot, cleaned up things the best we could, and then we made it to our wigwam hotels, and which was fantastic. That was our first stay in one of those. It's definitely a different experience. And then in the morning I actually swapped out the cooling fan while it was relatively cool outside.
Ended up a little disappointed a few times on the trip because been intending to make the car E85 compatible. And basically, the fuel system is built to handle it, and all I'm missing is the flex fuel sensor. So when I actually found some E85 pumps, it's like, oh man, it could have run a little higher boost. But I think the wife wouldn't have been too thrilled if I started playing with something new on the road. So a second coolant fan went out on our way to headed to Williams, Arizona. So nice thing is we actually stayed 2 days there because we took the train up to the Grand Canyon. That's where ended up doing cleaning that radiator filter and replaced a second cooling fan. And that still didn't get us quite where we needed as far as cooling the whole car. It was also nice that I wired in the cooling fans to the Haltech using a solid state relay, but that allowed me on this trip to reprogram it on the fly. The big thing was living up north, I actually just had them kind of change their duty cycle depending on temperature. So that way they just, most of the time you would never hear them kick on, and that worked really well until we got in the south and you just needed them on and on fully and much earlier to try to dump some heat. So that was as simple as hooking up the laptop and reprogramming. One funny part with the nav system is ended up not taking the correct exit because they might have changed the whole approach. But anyway, ended up off route on the navigation system, just trying to buzz to our next stop, and we actually literally were sent through a city park. So that was a little interesting, and you had to wonder. There's one other spot where we're kind of trying to use it to follow the route, and we ended up going off route kind of into the old part of the town, which is literally like a little town center that was a traffic circle and then back out. So that was definitely not the quickest route. So the time we were headed through like Cool Springs and headed up to Oatman, the car was getting really hot again. In fact, that's probably one of the tightest and windiest sections of Route 66, and there's no place to pull off. So that was the first time we actually had the engine temperature up to 260 degrees. So we kind of pegged out the odometer gauge, and there was a spot at the top to pull over and had the hood up, letting it cool a little bit. And of course, we figured out that it was all downhill from there. So had the bright idea of, well, it's going to cool down in a hurry if it's just idling so the coolant pumps are running, and just coast down the other side. It was a great idea until the car kept wanting to stall, so then you lose power brakes and power steering, and at a certain point you just tell the passenger, just close your eyes, it'll be fine. I don't think it was nearly as much of a problem, but it did cool down quite a bit, and we were off and running again through another stretch of the desert.
So the trip through the desert actually really messed with Haltech's self-learning on the idle control. Just the car was having difficulty, and it made the last, I think it was 60 miles that took 2 hours through LA to get to Santa Monica Pier, very difficult. It was a little bit after that I actually realized what had happened and shut off the self-learn and corrected the values in those tables and got her to idle again. Because the car was surging about 1,000 RPMs, it would be 600 to 1,600 RPM, just getting into turbo boost, which made it a handful.
So some of you are probably wondering fuel economy wise how it was on this trip. And initially we were only getting about 16, 17 miles a gallon, but with running the Haltech with their wideband O2s, we had it set to self-learn, plus occasionally when I was the passenger I could sit there with the laptop and look at it a little more and kind of carefully program. Anyway, we actually got the fuel economy up to 26 miles a gallon. The real irony was this car actually preferred to run hot when it comes to the fuel economy. It definitely made a drop in power, but each afternoon as the engine bay was heat soaked and hotter out, we actually got the better fuel economy. So with the turbo system, I was kind of glad, rather than just putting the output of the turbo directly into the throttle body, which a lot of guys will do because it's easier, and especially on an A body where you can't fit an intercooler in front of the car. But I had done a liquid intercooler, and so it had its own electric pump and radiator sitting in the fender and fan. So nice part is we brought laptop, of course, to access to Haltech if there's any issues, and went in there and just simply turned both of those units on all the way to just keep pumping more of the heat from the engine compartment out. It actually caught me off guard a couple times walking by the car, because you don't expect a lot of heat coming out from your fender. You almost assume you have a brake problem every time. And the other interesting thing is the tire on that corner needs to be replaced. I mean, the other front one is, it's kind of neat. Wore out tires driving the car around. That's unusual for custom cars, but yeah, the left front tire is shot.
So if you're going to do a trip like this, definitely buy your guidebooks. We also found a wonderful fold-out map once we were on the trip that really helped. Most of the maps, though, they don't list the current roads well enough to really help, or what the surrounding roads. But so that's a little bit of a challenge. But make sure you plan it. Hopefully, you take more time on the route than we did. I think that would add a little more enjoyment. But we still This would be one of our more memorable trips. And also, if you're driving an old car like this, make sure you bring some tools, a few spare parts. I think I had quite a few engine control parts with, and aluminum tape was really handy. So I hope you enjoyed this. I mean, it's more about the car and a bit about the route, but anyway, if you want to check out more on the car, I'll probably put a few links in the back on some of the other videos I've done on the systems on it, and thanks for watching.